Is Columbina bland or brilliant or something in between? At first, she was a haunting presence in arguably the most iconic trailer or teaser since the launch of Genshin, a moment which remains unsurpassed to this day. By the time she appeared in-game, those years of speculation had built a tower of expectations. A handful of voice lines, a single trailer, and a lot of extrapolation had led people to conjure up an image of who she was supposed to be, something which truly stood out from the rest of what the game had given us. So, when her reality turned out to be something quieter, softer, and more emotional, the response was rather mixed. Let's talk about it. To understand the different perspectives on Columbina, we have to start before we even knew her name, with Genshin's storytelling approach from day one and the consequences it created. Tevat is a huge world with layer upon layer of history. In the early years, the narrative of the Archon quest barely scratched the surface. Each story held hints of the deeper story, but the questionable presentation and the focus on more immediate conflicts left many players unaware of these greater depths. Instead, those depths were designed to encourage Lorechaeology. The world quest sketched some outlines, but the answers were hidden in the scattered text throughout the game, waiting in in-world ephemera like books or diaries, or buried in the descriptions of in-game items. Many people loved this approach. It left them with a grand and complex puzzle to piece together as they made connections between the hidden truths within these obscure texts and pieced together a wider picture of where the story was heading. This section of the community only grew over time. As a result, huge swathes of the game's audience consisted of people primed to take even small number of known facts and extrapolate from there. In the early days, the Fatui were presented much more as your stereotypical anime villains, the Harbingers even more than the rank and file. We met Signora first, then Child, and then Scaramouche. Signora was portrayed as an icy witch with a burning rage inside. Child was a friendly betrayer who would happily stab us in the back, whose defining desire was to find a challenge and fight it to the death. Scaramouche was a spiky little asshole who had no respect for anything. There were hints of greater depth, but they were fairly subtle at that point, drowned out by just how in-your-face these early Harbingers were. A little of it was present in the story quests, and more hidden in their profile pages, but it rarely made its way into the main story. I'd also argue that the story shied away from fully exploring the questionable morals of the other side. Raiden's abhorrent treatment of her people was swept aside the moment she had a change of heart, and neither Venti nor Zhongli were paragons of virtue either, but it felt like they were presented as the good guys, and despite their internal conflict, we were supposed to root for them. The potential for more nuanced narrative was always there, but to many it felt like Hoyo were aiming for a more traditional tale of obvious good versus blatant evil. And then, a few weeks before Sumeru's debut patch, Hoyo dropped the Winter Knight's Lazzo. Before, the Harbingers had seemed a mysterious and intimidating force, but one which was distant, looming in the background. Many people hunted for hints at who they were and speculated about their roles and personalities. Then, all of a sudden, we got to see their faces and hear them speak. The vibe of the group was menacing and manipulative, the dialogue was filled with subtext and sniping, and Piero's declaration of intent gave people chills. In the name of Her Majesty, the Tsaritsa, we will seize authority from the gods. And to add to this, they included voice lines in Child's profile in the game, which shared his perspective on each of the Harbingers in turn. Of course, the community speculation would go into overdrive. Columbina's ethereal singing was a haunting backdrop to the scene. She seemed to be smiling slightly as she sang her lament, draped across Signora's coffin, in stark contrast to the stiff postures of the others. Her only voice lines were pointed towards Dottore, saying he looked young today and asking about one of his segments. Her design seemed odd as well. Swamped by her winter coat, she had a strange lacy veil over her eyes and angel wings adorning the back of her hair. Child's voice line about the damselette says he has no idea why that girl is ranked as the third strongest Harbinger and that something about her just doesn't feel right. That is objectively very little to go off, but that section of the community, of course, took those crumbs and ran with them. Many expected the Harbingers to continue in their established role as true villains, and Columbina's eerie vibe led to speculation that she would either be a creepy psychopath or some kind of eldritch abomination. To people with this perspective, her two voice lines came across as her teasing Dottore, and her innocent voice seemed sinister. This was reinforced by some fan videos, which cemented her as horror adjacent in many people's minds, and they anticipated her for that reason. In retrospect, people focused too much on the second part of Child's voice line, which said she doesn't feel right, and too little on the part which said he didn't understand why she's ranked so high, which points to him not understanding her. Either way, I personally was not into the speculation side of things at all and had zero expectations of her. She showed little personality in the trailer, so she didn't catch my attention. She just felt a little out of place, and I was far more interested in others like Arlecchino or Capitano. A few months later, we got Wanderer's voice line about her, which describes her as oblivious and innocent, unconcerned and unfeeling. Another year later, Arlecchino said she's very special and unpredictable. Neither really said much at all, and if anything, Arlecchino's feels more like a slightly bemused acquaintance. It's also worth highlighting that the Harbingers, which were given the spotlight in between the Winter Knights Lazzo and Columbina's debut, each strayed further from the villain's expectation than the last. Scaramouche, Arlecchino, and Capitano. One, a villain with their personality rewritten, another portrayed as formidable but rarely antagonistic, the third, an honorable and self-sacrificing leader whose potential was set aside. Was the trailer's tone a promise, or was it misdirection? Over the course of those 3 years, the story seemed to move further away from the black and white portrayal and lean towards a more nuanced morality. By the end of Natlan, I was pretty convinced that while there might be conflict with the Fatui in Not Cry, the antagonists would come from elsewhere and we'd end up working with the Harbingers instead. However, some still hoped for some payoff to that promise. Dottore was in Sumeru too, and he was truly evil, so it wasn't unreasonable to think that the Harbingers who were left could live up to those first impressions. When we met her, Columbina was enigmatic, ethereal, disconnected more than anything else. Her behavior was strange, her responses cryptic. She seemed to have little interest in talking at all, and she came across as unconcerned with the world in front of her. We learned she didn't even know her own true name, that she felt out of place with both the Harbingers and the Frostmoon Scions, and her only desire was to leave the world entirely and return to the moon. As someone who had zero expectations going in, I found her fascinating. She seemed less a character and more an idea, not a person you could care about, but a divine goddess who belonged on some other plane of existence entirely. Everything she said made me want to find out more. Her description of how the Frostmoon Scions worship turned to greed, the hints of cold and emotionless relationship with the Fatui, her questions of who can the gods turn to when they have nothing left to give. I was enjoying the rest of the story, but Columbina already had my attention. And for once, Hoyo let that spark grow slowly over time. In between the Archon quests, we had the Selenic Chronicles. We could visit Columbina once a week and have a little interaction which showed us another tiny facet of her character. This system is not without its downsides, which we'll touch on later, but if you got the intended experience, it gave the story the space it needed. Each time we visited her, she opened up a little more, and we slowly began to understand who she was. More importantly, with each interaction, she became just a little bit more connected to us in turn. A persistent problem in gachas is that it feels like every new character we meet goes from stranger to best friend in no time at all. While that can happen in real life, when it happens every time, it starts to feel shallow and contrived, especially when it doesn't match the essence of each character. Not Cry had several who accepted us with zero hesitation, but it also had others, like Sandroni, who took much longer to let their guard down. In Columbina's case, our tentative friendship felt truly earned, as we slowly built it piece by piece. Over time, Columbina started taking an active part in events. She rescued the others from their fight with Rerir, though he then hunted her to steal her power for himself. Her interactions with the others led them to start seeing her as a person too, but each confrontation with the enemy consumed some of her remaining strength. Then, the world of Tavad rejected her. She had no identity, no true name, and now that the people of the Frostmoon Scions no longer worshipped her, she had no purpose. Her inherent power had been keeping her alive, but it was all but spent. She passed the tipping point and became invisible, a fading ghost whose time was almost up. But she now had friends who cared, and so the search began for her true name, which could anchor her to the world once more. The idea of a true name is a cliché in fantasy, and the eventual solution that her name was not hidden in her past, but instead an active choice she needed to make for herself is also nothing new. Some might argue that this automatically means the story is uninteresting and unoriginal, but in my opinion, clichés exist because they have a deep inherent meaning, and good writing can use clichés to tell an engaging tale. In Columbina's case, for me, the heart of the story was the continuation of her arc from the earlier acts. For the first time, she could see how much her friends and acquaintances cared about her and watch them as they worked together to bring her back. Her perspective on the world was changing, and that is what led to the solutions to the surface level plot. For those who weren't already invested in Columbina, it probably came across as shallow and uninteresting, but for those of us who cared, it was deeply moving. And that all led to Moonprayer Night, which leaned into the aspect even more. I've seen some people say they found it tedious, but for me, every moment was captivating. One of the most effective techniques in storytelling is to set up a conflict between two opposing forces within a single character, something they want versus something they need. This technique starts with an emotional wound, something which makes the character unhappy with their life. They struggle to deal with it and think they know the solution. Their want is something external they strive towards, which they believe will make them happy. However, deep down even that will not solve their pain, because there's something else they need which will let them achieve true happiness. Columbina's wound is her deep isolation. Every interaction in her life had been purely transactional, and never once did she feel a moment of affection from anyone around her. She retreated to her lonely cave, where she spent her time softly singing lullabies to her ghostly Henki, longing for something more. She thinks the solution to her pain is to return to the moon. It's where she came from, the source of her power, and so of course she desperately hopes that by returning there, she will finally belong. But what she needs is connection. Friends who care about her for her own sake, who would give to her without expecting anything in return beyond her mere existence. So every moment of the Moon Prayer Festival was beautifully bittersweet. It was framed as a final farewell, with Columbina enjoying one last night on Tevat before she traveled to the moon forever. Every step along the way you could see that she was finally experiencing the love and friendship which she truly needed, and yet she remained set upon her path. In a world where people have become ever more used to judging stories by how cinematic their climax can be, this felt like a culmination of a quiet, meaningful character arc which let the emotional weight of Columbina's inevitable decision reverberate through every moment. For every moment of the festival, I kept hoping she would change her mind and realize that actually this was her home, even though it was painfully obvious that she wouldn't. And then, just as Columbina stepped forwards to break our hearts and leave us, in stepped Dottore to make it even worse. Columbina's journey through the moon's reflection just made that connection even deeper. As I've said before, I loved everything about this sequence. The revelation that she was the mysterious influence who had been helping us all along was satisfying, and Lunatar's creation and purpose finally made sense. It's such an interesting reversal. At first, she had been physically present, but emotionally detached and mostly unconcerned. The second time around, she was separated physically, but her emotional connection led her to play a crucial role in shaping events. This emotional journey we'd experienced with her became vital to everything we'd done elsewhere. Then, at the end of the road, she met her long-lost sisters for the first time, learned about the history which led to her existence, and took action to solve the problems she was facing and return to the present with all her power restored for the final confrontation with Dottore. I loved every step along the way of Columbina's story, from the gradual building of our connection, through her slow acceptance of the friendship she had earned, to her return as a true goddess determined to save her people and confident in her own existence at last. I'd argue this betrayal did fulfill the promises set up by those early crumbs, even though her aura of purity and innocence made it clear from the start that those dreams of a terrifying Eldritch nightmare would go unfulfilled. There was that one brief moment at the start where she got her hackles up and it seemed like she could become a threat, but that turned out to be the only time we see that side of her. I do think it would have been cool to see that side unleashed against Dottore at the end, but I can see the value in leaning more towards expressing her personal growth instead. Some claim this was a retcon, but I'm unconvinced, though I do think Hoyo should have added some more voice lines which made it clearer that the ones we did get were perhaps unreliable narrators. It's sad to see many people feel so disappointed. They came in hoping for something specific, and when what they got was so far from it, they just could not get on board with what happened in the end. It probably didn't help that her portrayal was more subtle than spectacular. Hers was a quiet, slow, emotional journey which wove together common cliches with competent execution of the most basic fundamentals of storytelling. The lore it exposed was interesting, and the time travel added some much needed narrative flair, but in the end, I can't really say it did anything I haven't seen before. I just don't think it needed to. Maybe that made her feel bland to some, especially in contrast to what they hoped for. I think there's an interesting irony here. Those who are most disappointed with Columbina feel that way because they placed expectations on her which she just could not meet. Exactly the problem she encountered in her early days with the Frost Moon Scions and then again with the Fatui. For me, she's far from bland, but I wouldn't call her story brilliant either. For many of us, Hoyo had completely burned through any lingering trust in their storytelling. I think a simple tale, given space to grow and told with basic competence, was exactly what the game needed. There are a couple more specific critiques about her which I think are worth discussing as well. Some feel that she's unrelatable. At every point in her life, her basic needs were met. She always had sufficient food, shelter, and safety, and was surrounded by people who literally worshipped her. To them, she came across as a spoiled princess whose sadness feels out of place when put in context with her privileged position. Some even interpreted her description of the Frostmoon Science treatment as her claiming they were abusive towards her. But not all trauma comes from abuse, and not all stories have to focus on people who are fighting for their most basic needs to be fulfilled. Many of us have felt that desperately painful isolation, which can come even when you're surrounded by others. When no one knows you, they cannot really care. Can you call someone your friend if they're only there when they need something from you, but disappear when you're in need? Columbina's early experiences taught her that nobody cared about her. Even those who worshipped her just wanted a transactional relationship. They praised and worshipped her, and in return, they expected gifts. Their demands escalated until she could give no more. Her experience with the Harbingers, from her perspective, was just more of the same. They weren't abusive, but her entire life before we met her would have left her deeply scarred and desperate for something more. Everyone needs friendship and intimacy and the feeling that they belong. It's hard to see that if you're in the middle of a fight for your basic survival, but once you reach that point, mere survival is not enough. Some also felt that there was a disconnect between the general message that she wanted to return to help her friends, emphasis on the plural, and the fact that the first person she looked to or thought of was the traveler. As someone who finds it annoying when there's unearned closeness in a game, I just flat out disagree. This time, through those moments in the earlier acts and the Selenic Chronicles, they actually put the effort in to show our friendship slowly growing over time. And then, everything which followed was a natural consequence of us showing her a different way to interact with others in the world. Our friendship came first and led to the others. With Arlecchino and Sandroni, she didn't think of their earlier interactions as friendship at the time. She thought they were being transactional because that's all she'd ever known. It wasn't until we came along that she was able to understand the subtext behind the others' actions and start to reciprocate. You could argue that this would make them into the ones she should feel closest to by the end, but to me, it echoes how difficult it can be to adjust an existing relationship's trajectory when circumstances change, and it makes more sense to me that she'd look to the traveler first before the others. I love that she has different levels of relationship with different people. Closeness isn't forced even when they do interact, and others like Inefa came across as more acquaintances to her, a friend of a friend, with potential for deeper connections in the future. And incidentally, personally, I do not get a romantic vibe from any of her interactions, so I can't relate to anyone saying she's waifu bait. She is a character designed to make us care for her, and I can understand why people would ship her with the traveler, but it comes across as purely platonic to me. Some also felt that the third most powerful Harbinger should have been a powerful villain, and were disappointed by the few glimpses we got of her time with the Fatui and how pure and innocent she seems to be, a polar opposite of what they expected of the Harbingers in general, and her in particular. Putting aside the question of whether the Fatui are even villains at this point, I took it more that she was recruited for her raw power alone, and it sounded more like being lured into a cult when you're lonely and looking for a family. It's unclear what they're doing in the first place, but she clearly did lend her power to them at times, so we just don't know what she was actually involved in yet. We do know Dottore had been manipulating her though. If anything, I get the sense that the Tsaritsa likes collecting powerful people to boost her ego and her image. Columbina leaving could be a hit to both, which would then lead to her agreeing to the Pale Star Edict. For me, it's even more interesting to see what direction they go with the Harbingers and the Tsaritsa, knowing that their reputation does not match reality. I want the story to have villains who both come across as genuine threat and challenge our perspective, but I don't particularly care who those villains are. It would have been awesome for the Harbingers to have been the intimidating, powerful, competent, and malevolent force that they appeared to be when the Winter Knight's Lazzo first dropped, but even back then, it was pretty obvious Hoyo were intending us to see both sides. So, back to those Selenic Chronicles. I both love and hate them. I love how effective they were at showing our friendship with Columbina grow slowly over time, especially since the changes to her character became so gradual and organic. I quickly came to look forward to each weekly slice of life, and it helped build up my excitement for each chapter of the main story in turn. And it was brilliant to see them locked entirely when Columbina sacrificed herself. It made that sense of loss feel real to me, because something I had come to enjoy and expect as a weekly ritual was taken from me. me. But at the same time, I hate that they hard-locked them with a time gate. I started Notcry's Archon quest a few weeks late, so I was always a few weeks behind, and even at first, it was frustrating that they didn't include any catch-up mechanism. When the Chronicles were locked, it was even more annoying to be behind, but after it unlocked was the worst. The 2 or 3 I played after the end of Notcry's Archon quest all showed Columbina talking about how much she wanted to go to the moon and how she'd miss everyone once she's gone. Those conversations would sure have hit different if I had been allowed to play them before that happened. Oh yeah. I dread to think how weird it's going to be for future players. Will they play the first Chronicle, then complete all the Archon quest, and then have months of the original weekly anecdotes to slowly work through, even though they'd all be far too late? They should have unlocked on specific dates and maybe required at least a day between each round instead, so that we could all experience the emotional moments at the right part of the story. Great idea, very flawed execution that I hope they'll fix for future players. And finally, her gameplay. I've seen a fair few people say they're bitterly disappointed with Columbina's kit and animations, that as a highly anticipated character 3 years in the making, they should have been something special. I do think Genshin would benefit from adding more mechanically diverse characters, but I don't think the game is really designed to take advantage of it yet. The combat has always been more focused on team building, synergies, and rotations instead, and it would take a major overhaul for the combat to lean into things like that. Personally, I love how well her animations express the character she turned out to be, and I just love having her in my teams. She's strong right now because the endgame content shills lunar mechanics to high heaven, and she might drop off a fair bit once things move on to some new mechanic, but I really don't care as long as I can still use her in my teams. I'm dissatisfied with the general state of Genshin's HP inflation, power creep, and endgame situation, but Columbina for me is not one of the problems whatsoever. In the end, Columbina was never the terrifying enigma some people hope she'd be. She began her journey weighted down with expectations placed on her by the science, by the Fatui, and by the audience watching from the outside. She spent her entire existence being valued for what she could provide, never for who she was, almost until it was too late. Her arc relies on slow accumulation of small moments of meaning. For people who wanted a villain, it felt toothless. For those who wanted absolute cinema, it felt mundane. But for many, it offered something Genshin often struggles to deliver, a simple story given space to breathe, which became more meaningful with every step along the way. Columbina isn't a masterpiece, but I loved every minute and I wouldn't change a thing, and I hope this is far from the last we see of her. And, in the end, isn't that what we really want from stories? Until next time.